The door behind her creaked open, and Riley spun around, heart leaping into her throat. There, standing in the doorway, was Thomas. But he wasn't alone. Another man stood beside him, tall and imposing. His eyes were dark, and his posture was tense. Riley's heart skipped a beat as she realized that the two men were in on it together. They weren't just after Maverick, they were after something else entirely. "Riley," Thomas said, his voice cold and distant now. "I didn't want this to happen. But you've made things harder than they needed to be. You shouldn't have gotten involved with Maverick. This is bigger than you." Riley's mind was spinning. Chapter 1. An Impossible Dream. Riley had always dreamed of horses. Not the way kids fantasize about becoming astronauts or movie stars. Her dream was steady, constant, like a heartbeat. She could almost feel the wind in her hair, hear the pounding of hooves beneath her. But in real life, she had never even touched a horse. Her family barely made ends meet. Riding lessons were expensive, and her mom, who worked double shifts at a diner, had no time to entertain impossible dreams. Her dad had left years ago, and Riley had long since stopped expecting him to care. Whenever she mentioned horses, her mom would sigh and shake her head. "Horses are for rich kids, Riley. Not us." But she couldn't let it go. One afternoon as she walked home from school, she took a different route, past the outskirts of town, where old barns and abandoned buildings stood like forgotten memories. That's when she saw it, a rusting sign, barely hanging onto a wooden post. Oak Ridge Equine Rescue. The letters were faded, the paint peeling. Beyond the gate, a row of stables stretched into the distance, their roofs sagging, doors hanging open like gaping mouths. Riley hesitated. The place looked abandoned. But then, from somewhere inside, she heard a rustling sound. Her heart kicked up. Was there still a horse here? Glancing around to make sure no one was watching, she pushed the gate open and slipped through. The smell of damp hay and old wood filled the air as she moved between the empty stalls. Dust floated in the light streaming through broken windows. And then, at the very end of the stable, she saw him. A horse. Not just any horse. He was massive, bigger than any she'd seen up close. His dark bay coat was caked with dirt, his mane tangled and unkempt. He stood stiffly in the shadows of his stall, ribs faintly visible beneath his skin. A long white blaze ran down his face like a scar. Riley barely breathed. "Hey there," she whispered. The horse flicked an ear but didn't move. His eyes locked onto hers, dark, unreadable, filled with something she couldn't quite place. She took a cautious step closer. That's when he lunged. With terrifying speed, he bared his teeth and snapped at her, his hooves slamming against the wooden stall door. Riley yelped and stumbled back, her heart hammering. For a long moment, they just stared at each other. Then, from behind her, a voice rang out. "You shouldn't be here." Riley spun around. A tall man stood in the doorway, arms crossed. His face was lined with age, his gray hair messy beneath an old baseball cap. His boots were covered in dust, his flannel shirt stained with sweat. I didn't mean to." The man sighed and rubbed his face. "Let me guess. You saw the gate open and got curious." Riley swallowed. "Yeah." He exhaled and glanced toward the stall. "You're not the first kid who's come sniffing around for him." She frowned. "Who is he?" The man hesitated, then nodded toward the horse. "That's Maverick. Used to be a champion." Riley turned back to the stall, eyes widening. "A racehorse. Fastest one I ever trained," the man muttered. "Before the injury." Her stomach twisted. What happened? The man, who she now realized must be the owner of this place, leaned against a post, eyes distant. "Tore a ligament in his last race. Owners dumped him here. Figured he wasn't worth the medical bills." Riley's chest tightened. "That's awful." The man let out a bitter laugh. "That's racing." He straightened. "Place is shutting down soon. If nobody takes him, he won't have anywhere to go." The words hit her like a punch. What do you mean, won't have anywhere to go? The man met her eyes but didn't answer. He didn't have to. Riley looked back at Maverick. The anger in his eyes wasn't just anger. It was fear. I want to help, she blurted. The man raised an eyebrow. Help? He chuckled, shaking his head. You don't just help a horse like him. He's dangerous. Won't let anyone near him. Riley straightened her shoulders. I don't care. I can try. The man studied her for a long moment. Then, to her surprise, he nodded. All right, he said. But don't expect it to be easy. She turned back to Maverick. He still stood in the far corner of the stall, muscles tense, eyes guarded. A cold breeze blew through the stable, but for the first time in her life, Riley felt warm. She had no idea what she was getting herself into. But she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't leaving without trying. Chapter 2. Secret Visits. Riley couldn't stop thinking about Maverick. That night, as she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, she replayed the moment he had lunged at her, the wild look in his eyes. Most people would have been terrified. She wasn't. Maverick wasn't just angry, he was scared. And she knew what it was like to be scared. She had to go back. The next afternoon, Riley made up an excuse about staying late for a school project and took the long way home. Her backpack bounced against her shoulders as she hurried past old farmhouses and empty fields, heart pounding in anticipation. When she reached Oakridge, she hesitated. Was this stupid? The man, she realized she still didn't know his name, hadn't exactly invited her back. But he hadn't told her to stay away either. The gate creaked as she pushed it open. The stables were quiet. The late afternoon sun filtered through cracks in the roof, dust swirling in golden streaks. She walked past the empty stalls, the air thick with the scent of hay and old wood. Maverick was in the same place as before, standing in the shadows of his stall. Riley took a careful step forward. Hey, she whispered. His ears flicked toward her, but he didn't move. She reached into her backpack and pulled out an apple. She had taken it from home, unsure if he'd accept it. Holding it in her open palm, she stretched her hand over the railing. Maverick's nostrils flared as he sniffed the air. For a split second, Riley thought he might take it. Then, without warning, he bared his teeth and lunged. Riley jerked her hand back, her pulse slamming in her ears. The apple hit the ground and rolled across the hay-covered floor. Maverick snorted, stomping a hoof. His muscles were tense, his dark eyes locked onto hers. Riley forced herself to stay put. I get it, she said softly. You don't trust people. Maverick turned his head away, as if dismissing her. She picked up the apple, dusted it off, and gently set it on the edge of the stall before stepping back. I'll be back tomorrow. And she was. For the next week, Riley visited every afternoon. At first, Maverick ignored her. Then, he started watching her. One evening, she caught him stretching his neck toward the apple she had left behind. He took it, but only when she was far enough away. A small victory. The old man, who she finally learned was named Hank, eventually noticed. You're wasting your time, kid, he muttered one evening, watching as Riley sat outside Maverick's stall, reading aloud from an old book she had found at the library. I don't think I am, Riley said, flipping a page. Hank leaned against the stable door, shaking his head. That horse is broken. Riley met his gaze. Maybe he's not broken. Maybe he's just waiting for someone who won't give up on him. Hank sighed but didn't argue. The weather turned colder, but the visits continued. Maverick still didn't trust her, but he no longer flinched when she came close. Then, on the 9th day, something changed. Riley entered the stable as usual, but as she approached Maverick's stall, she noticed something different. He was standing closer. Her breath caught in her throat. Slowly, she reached into her pocket and pulled out another apple. This time, she didn't set it down. She held it in her open palm. Maverick hesitated. His ears flicked back. His muscles tensed. Then, in a movement so fast she barely saw it. He dipped his head and took the apple from her hand. Riley froze. Maverick chewed slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. The moment lasted only a few seconds, but it was enough. She had won his first sliver of trust. But before she could celebrate, Hank's voice rang out from the doorway. "Riley," he said grimly. She turned, startled by the seriousness in his tone. "We have a problem," he said. The owner finally made a decision. Her stomach dropped. "What decision?" she asked, but deep down, she already knew. Hank hesitated, then said, "They're selling the horses. All of them. Including Maverick." Chapter 3. A Desperate Plan. Riley's heart pounded. Selling Maverick. The words felt like a slap, knocking the air from her lungs. She stared at Hank, waiting for him to say he was joking. But his face was stone serious. "Who's buying him?" she asked, her voice tight. Hank exhaled through his nose. "Don't know yet. Could be another stable. Could be a slaughterhouse." Riley's stomach twisted. "No. That can't happen." "That's reality, kid," Hank muttered. "Unwanted horses don't get fairy tale endings." Riley turned toward Maverick's stall. He stood stiffly in the shadows, his ears flicking at the sound of their voices. He didn't understand what was happening, but she did. And she wasn't about to let it happen. Hank watched her for a long moment. "You really care about that horse, don't you?" Riley swallowed the lump in her throat. "He deserves better." Hank rubbed a hand over his face. "Even if you wanted to save him, what's your plan? You got money for a horse? A place to keep him? Feed him?" She had nothing. No money. No land. No idea what she was doing. But she had to try. That night, she barely slept. Instead, she sat at her desk, writing in an old notebook, crossing things out, rewriting them. By morning, she had a list. Riley's plan to save Maverick. Find out how much he costs. Get the money. Convince Hank to help. Figure out where to keep him. Save him before it's too late. Simple. Except for the fact that she was a broke 16-year-old with no job. The next day, she confronted Hank. "How much?" she asked. Hank raised an eyebrow. "For Maverick. More than you can afford. Try me." Hank sighed and leaned against the stall door. "He's not worth much anymore. Too injured to race, too wild for a riding horse. If a private buyer shows interest, maybe a couple thousand. If he goes to auction." He hesitated. "Meat buyers don't pay much. Maybe 700. Riley's hands curled into fists. 700. That was still more than she had, which was exactly zero. But maybe not impossible. She got to work. Step 1. Get money. She searched online for part-time jobs, but nobody was hiring a high school student on short notice. Babysitting? No luck. Asking her mom? Not an option. Then she had an idea. She went through everything she owned. Clothes she never wore. An old skateboard. A tablet her dad had sent for Christmas years ago, still in its box. She listed everything for sale online. It wasn't enough. Then, she remembered the coffee can. For years, her mom had kept a battered tin on the top shelf of the kitchen, labeled emergency fund. Riley had never touched it. But wasn't this an emergency? That night, while her mom was asleep, she climbed onto the counter, pulled the can down, and pried off the lid. She held her breath. Inside was a mix of crumpled bills and loose change. She counted quickly, her hands shaking. $82. Not enough. But she wasn't giving up. Step 2. Convince Hank. The next afternoon, she met Hank at the stables. "Teach me how to work with him," she said. Hank frowned. "What?" "I need to prove he's worth saving. You said he's too wild to be useful. What if I can change that?" Hank let out a short laugh. "Kid, you have no idea what you're asking. Then teach me, Riley insisted. Please. Hank studied her, then glanced at Maverick. The horse stood stiffly in his stall, watching them with wary eyes. Finally, Hank sighed. Fine. But if you get hurt, that's on you. Riley nodded, ignoring the knot of nerves in her stomach. Step 3. Train the untamable. The first lesson was simple. Don't get killed. Never let him think you're afraid, Hank said. Horses read energy. If you're scared, he'll know. Riley swallowed hard and stepped closer to the stall. Maverick pinned his ears back but didn't move. Talk to him, Hank instructed. Riley hesitated, then whispered, Hey, buddy. I know you don't trust me. But I'm not giving up on you. Maverick snorted but didn't lunge. A tiny victory. For the next few days, Riley followed Hank's instructions. She spent hours near the stall, letting Maverick get used to her presence. She learned to read his body language, the way his ears flicked, the way his muscles tensed before he moved. Progress was slow, but she refused to give up. Then, one afternoon, something incredible happened. She entered the stable as usual, but this time, Maverick stepped forward. Not away. Forward. Her breath caught. Slowly, she lifted a hand, keeping it steady. Maverick hesitated. Then, to her shock, he stretched his neck forward and breathed against her palm. A soft, warm exhale. Trust. It lasted only a second, but it was enough. And then, Hank's voice cut through the moment. Riley. We've got trouble. She turned, her heart sinking at the look on his face. What? Hank exhaled sharply. The buyers are coming this weekend. The blood drained from Riley's face. She only had 3 days. Chapter 4. The clock is ticking. 3 days. That was all the time Riley had to stop Maverick from being sold. Every second counted, and she wasn't wasting a single one. After school, she sprinted straight to the stables, her backpack bouncing on her shoulders. The air smelled like damp hay and old wood, familiar now. Hank was already there, leaning against the stable door, watching her with a skeptical expression. You look like you're about to rob a bank, he muttered. Riley ignored him. I have a plan. Hank sighed. This should be good. She pulled out her notebook, flipping to her messy list of ideas. I sold some of my stuff, but it's not enough. I need more money fast. And I need to prove Maverick can be handled before the buyers get here. Hank raised an eyebrow. And how do you plan to do that? Riley took a deep breath. I need to get him out of the stall. Silence. Then Hank let out a short, humorless laugh. You're crazy. I mean it, Hank. He's been locked up too long. Maybe that's why he's so aggressive. He needs to move. To remember he's not just some forgotten horse in a stall. Hank ran a hand down his face. Kid, that's not how this works. Maverick isn't just some lazy pony who needs a walk in the sunshine. He's unpredictable. Dangerous. You step into that stall, and he could kill you without meaning to. I don't believe that, Riley shot back. I think he's scared. And if I don't try, he's as good as gone anyway. Hank studied her for a long moment, then muttered, Damn it, under his breath. Fine, he said. But we do this my way. Slow. Careful. You follow my instructions exactly. No hero moves. Relief flooded through Riley. Deal. Step 1. The halter. The first challenge was getting Maverick to wear a halter. When Riley stepped into the stall for the first time, she moved like she was stepping onto a frozen lake, slow and steady. Maverick's ears flicked back, and his muscles tensed. Talk to him, Hank instructed from the doorway. Low and steady. Riley swallowed hard. Hey, big guy. It's just me. No sudden moves, okay? Maverick eyed her warily but didn't bolt. That was progress. She held out the halter, letting him sniff it. His nostrils flared, but he didn't pull away. Good, Hank murmured. Now see if he'll let you touch his face. Riley's hand hovered just above Maverick's muzzle. He hesitated, his breath warm against her fingers. Then slowly, so slowly, she placed her palm against his face. Her chest tightened. This was the closest she had ever been. Maverick didn't lunge, didn't snap. He just stood there, watching her with those dark, unreadable eyes. A full minute passed before she gently slid the halter over his head. And he let her. She stepped back, her heart racing. I did it. Hank let out a low whistle. Well, I'll be damned. Step 2. Stepping outside. The next day, Riley showed up at the stables before the sun had fully risen. Today was the real test. She took a deep breath and unlatched Maverick's stall door. The second it creaked open, he stiffened. Easy, she whispered. You're okay. For a moment, he didn't move. Then, cautiously, he took a step forward. Riley's breath caught. One step turned into 2. Then 3. And suddenly, for the first time in years, Maverick was standing outside of his stall. Hank crossed his arms, watching carefully. Let's see how far he's willing to go. Riley gently tugged the lead rope. Maverick hesitated but followed. They walked slowly, each step careful and deliberate. When they reached the paddock, she let him stand, watching the open space ahead of him. Then, with a sharp exhale, Maverick broke into a trot. Riley had never seen anything so beautiful. His muscles rippled beneath his coat, his mane flying as he stretched out his legs. It wasn't perfect, he still moved with caution, as if testing his own limits, but he wasn't afraid. Not anymore. Hank let out a long breath. I'll be damned, he muttered again. Riley grinned. Told you. The final obstacle. That evening, as Riley sat outside Maverick's stall, exhaustion tugging at her. She had spent all her energy training, pushing herself to the limit. But she was still short on cash. She had counted her money 3 times. She was at $312, less than half of what she needed. Her stomach clenched. It wasn't enough. She had 1 day left. 1 chance. She glanced at her phone and pulled up her messages. There was one person she hadn't asked for help. Someone she never wanted to ask. But she had no choice. She hesitated, then typed. Riley. Hey, Dad. I need a favor. A few agonizing minutes later, the reply came. Dad. Well, that's a first. Riley gritted her teeth. Don't react. Don't let him get to you. Riley. I need money. It's important. Dad, how much? Her fingers trembled as she typed. Riley. At least $400. Please. I wouldn't ask if it wasn't serious. The typing bubbles appeared. Then disappeared. Then appeared again. Her pulse pounded. Finally, the message came. Dad, you're not in trouble, are you? Riley. No. It's for a horse. I'm trying to save him. More bubbles. More waiting. Then. Dad. Fine. I'll send $500. Don't ask me for more. Riley's breath caught. 500. More than she needed. Her vision blurred as relief crashed over her. She didn't want to owe her father anything, but right now? It didn't matter. She had done it. She had the money. But then Hank's voice cut through her thoughts. Kid, he called from the doorway. His tone was grim. She turned, heart sinking. What? The buyers just called. They're coming early. Her stomach dropped. Tomorrow morning. Chapter 5. The final hour. The night stretched long and suffocating. Riley couldn't sleep. The faint sound of crickets outside the stable seemed distant and foreign, as if the world around her was holding its breath. Tomorrow. Tomorrow, the buyers would arrive. The man who wanted to purchase Maverick, who saw only a dollar sign in the horse's eyes, would be here. The clock was ticking, and Riley's mind spun with 1,000 thoughts. She had the money. She had Maverick's trust. She had everything she needed to save him. Or so she thought. But she wasn't sure if it was enough. The cold concrete floor of the stable felt like ice beneath her feet. She walked the length of the barn in a daze, her thoughts scattered. Hank had already gone home for the night, probably to prepare for whatever was to come. Riley didn't know what she would do if she couldn't make it happen. She could still see Maverick's eyes in her mind. The moment he had allowed her to slip the halter over his head, the soft brush of his muzzle against her palm when he trusted her just a little bit more. That was the moment she knew she couldn't fail him. But now, there was no turning back. Riley finally made her way to Maverick's stall, where he stood quietly, nibbling at a pile of hay. His dark eyes flicked up when he saw her, his head raising slightly, like he was checking to see if she was still there. "I'm here," she whispered. Maverick snorted in response, his ears flicking back. He wasn't ready to trust her completely. She knew that. But they had come so far together. Riley took a deep breath and walked over to him. She placed her hand lightly on his neck, feeling the steady rhythm of his pulse beneath her fingers. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the sound of his breathing soothe her racing thoughts. She couldn't let him go. That was the one thing she was certain of. But as the hours dragged on, doubt crept in. What if she couldn't raise the rest of the money? What if the buyers didn't agree to let her take Maverick? What if she wasn't fast enough? The door to the stable creaked open, and Hank's voice cut through the silence. "You're still here." Riley turned to face him, swallowing the lump in her throat. "I have to make sure he's ready." Hank studied her, his face lined with exhaustion. "You've done everything you can." "I haven't." She looked at Maverick, then back at Hank. "I need to be sure I can take him home today." Hank crossed his arms, clearly not convinced. "There's no easy way to do this, kid. You know that." She nodded, frustration bubbling inside her. "I know." Hank's gaze softened for a moment. "You're sure about this?" Riley's heart tightened. "I'm sure." He exhaled deeply. "All right, then. I'll help you however I can." Riley gave him a small, grateful smile. The next morning came far too quickly. Riley barely slept a wink, her mind still running at full speed. She had barely enough time to prepare herself, but she gathered the money she had, stuffed it in her jacket pocket, and pulled herself together. Hank was waiting by the stable door when she arrived. His face was unreadable, but she could see the same exhaustion in his eyes. "The buyers are on their way," he said quietly. Riley nodded, trying to steady the storm inside her. "I'm ready." Hank unlocked Maverick's stall and stepped back, allowing Riley to go in. Maverick was already standing near the door, watching her with a mixture of caution and curiosity. Riley took a deep breath and stepped forward. She held out her hand toward him slowly, and he flinched slightly but didn't pull away. "Hey, buddy," she whispered. "You're gonna be okay. We're gonna get out of here." She secured the halter around his neck and gently led him out of the stall. Maverick's hooves clicked softly against the barn floor as he followed her, his breath coming in slow, steady puffs. Riley's heart hammered in her chest. The buyers were on their way, and she had no idea how this would end. But she had to believe it would work. She had to trust in the bond they had formed. Outside, the morning was crisp, the sky a pale blue. The barn doors opened, and Riley led Maverick toward the front yard, the sound of his hooves on the gravel echoing in the stillness. A dusty truck appeared in the distance, and Riley's stomach churned. Her breath came in shallow gasps as the truck pulled up to the barn. Two men stepped out. One was tall and broad-shouldered, the other older with graying hair and a weathered face. Riley swallowed hard, trying to push down the surge of panic rising in her throat. "Morning, miss," the older man greeted her. His eyes swept over Maverick, and Riley's heart sank at the way he looked at the horse, like he was nothing more than an object to be sold. "Is this the horse?" the other man asked, already reaching into his pocket for a wad of cash. Riley nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes." She fought to keep her hands steady as she took the money from her pocket. Her fingers trembled, but she didn't let the men see. She counted the bills quickly, handing them over without hesitation. "I'll take him," the younger man said. "We'll have him shipped out in the next couple of days." Riley's heart raced. This was it. She had the money. She had Maverick's trust. But would it be enough? "Wait," she said suddenly, stepping forward, her heart thundering. The men turned to her, puzzled. "I need more time," she said, her voice shaking. "I want to take him today. Please. Just give me one more chance." The men exchanged glances. "You're not serious," the younger man said, a smirk playing on his lips. "You think you can just take him now?" Riley held her breath. "Please. I've raised enough money to cover the cost. Just let me have him. I won't sell him to anyone else. "I'm sorry, kid," the older man said, cutting her off. "We don't do last-minute deals." Riley's heart dropped. It wasn't enough. She had failed. But then Hank stepped forward, interrupting. "She's right," he said, his voice cold. "She has the money. The deal is done." Riley turned, stunned. Hank's expression was stern, his eyes narrowed. "You said you were buying him, and the deal's already been made. You're not taking him anywhere." The two men exchanged uneasy glances. "What's this about?" the younger one asked. "I'm saying the horse is already sold." Hank's voice brooked no argument. There was a long, tense silence. Finally, the older man sighed, clearly unwilling to argue. "Fine. You have him." Riley stood frozen, unsure if she was dreaming. She looked at Hank, her voice shaking. "You." Hank gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod. "You got him, kid. Take him home." Chapter 6. Homeward Bound. Riley stood in stunned silence as the two men slowly climbed back into their truck and drove away. The dust lingered in the air, settling into the quiet morning like a thick fog. She could barely process what had just happened. One minute, she was sure she had lost Maverick for good, and the next, she had won. It felt unreal. Her hands were still trembling, but now the tremors were from a rush of relief. She blinked and looked around the yard, seeing everything in a new light, like the world had shifted just slightly, and she was finally on the other side of it. Maverick stood still beside her, his dark eyes watching her with an almost calm curiosity. She gently placed a hand on his neck, running her fingers through his mane. He shifted, but only slightly, as though to remind her that this victory wasn't just hers. It was theirs. Hank was standing nearby, his arms crossed, watching her closely. There was no hint of sarcasm or reluctance in his expression now, only a quiet respect. "Guess you showed them, huh?" Hank said, his voice soft. Riley couldn't help but smile, a real wide smile, for the first time in weeks. "Yeah," she said, her voice still thick with disbelief. "I guess I did." She looked down at the pile of money in her hand, the same money she had thought would slip right through her fingers. She had done it. She had saved him. "Well, there's still a lot to do," Hank continued, breaking her from her thoughts. He looked at Maverick, who was now gently grazing. "You've got the horse. Now you've got to make sure he's ready. You've got a lot of work ahead of you, kid. Don't forget that." Riley nodded slowly. The excitement of the win had momentarily clouded her judgment, but now the reality of her situation hit her full force. Maverick wasn't just going to heal on his own. He needed time, patience, and trust. They needed each other. "I know," she said quietly, glancing at Maverick, whose ears twitched in her direction. "But I'll do whatever it takes." Riley spent the next few days completely immersed in Maverick's care. She kept him in the barn most of the time to let him adjust to his new surroundings, only bringing him out for brief walks. She could already see the change in him. His muscles were less tense, his eyes no longer full of fear. But there were still moments of hesitation. Sometimes he'd balk at a loud noise, or startle when she moved too quickly. It reminded her of how fragile trust could be. One wrong move, one bad experience, and it could all unravel. And as much as she wanted to rush, She knew she couldn't afford that. Her mornings were spent grooming him, cleaning his hooves, and feeding him. Afternoons were for walking him through the fields and letting him run a little, reminding him that he wasn't just some caged animal. But the days also brought their own challenges. She had never expected it to be easy, but there were moments of frustration that made her question herself. Some days, Maverick seemed impossible to work with. He would pull away, refusing to let her get close. Other times, he seemed almost too eager, almost desperate to make up for lost time. Riley didn't know which one was harder to handle, the moments when Maverick pushed her away, or the ones when he clung to her for reassurance. One afternoon, as she tried to coax him into the paddock for a run, he balked, his body rigid with resistance. Riley's heart sank. "Come on, Maverick," she murmured, stepping closer. "You've done it before. Trust me." But he wouldn't move. He stood there, staring at her with those wide, dark eyes, and no matter how many soft words she spoke, nothing seemed to make a difference. She sighed, frustration bubbling inside her. "Why won't you just trust me?" she whispered, as if he could understand. But just as she was about to turn and walk away, Maverick took a tentative step forward. "Okay," she said, feeling a wave of relief wash over her. "That's a start." They stood there for a moment, just the two of them. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't smooth or easy. But it was progress. That was all that mattered now. Over the next week, things began to settle into a new routine. Riley was still working full-time at the cafe, but the hours had shifted. She used the early mornings to work with Maverick, and the evenings were spent researching training methods or getting advice from Hank. She knew she couldn't do it alone. As much as she wanted to prove herself, she needed guidance. Hank had been the first to admit that Maverick wasn't an easy case. And Riley wasn't naive enough to think she could fix him overnight. But even as she found herself making small victories, there was a constant knot in her stomach. What if the buyers came back? What if she couldn't keep Maverick after all? What if they decided they could still make a profit off him despite her best efforts? There were no answers, only questions. And then, one evening, the answers started to come. She was at the barn, brushing Maverick's coat, when a car pulled into the driveway. Riley looked up, her heart jumping in her chest. She recognized the truck immediately. It was the buyer's truck. Her pulse quickened as the truck doors opened, and the same two men from before climbed out. "Riley," the older man called, his voice tight with something that didn't sound like friendliness. "We need to talk." Riley's breath caught in her throat. She could feel the weight of the situation pressing on her chest, but she forced herself to walk toward them, keeping her head high. "What's going on?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "We made a mistake," the younger man said, his gaze flicking toward Maverick. "We didn't fully realize what kind of horse we were buying. We're not going to take him after all." Riley felt the floor drop from beneath her. She had expected something like this, just not so soon. The older man continued, "We're sorry. We've been looking at a different line of horses. But we just wanted to make sure you understood that we'll honor our agreement. And we'll let you keep the horse. You can have him." For a moment, Riley could only stare, disbelief clouding her mind. Was this really happening? "Wait," she said, her voice trembling. "You're saying you're leaving him with me? For good?" The younger man nodded. "Yes. We've decided to go in a different direction. Maverick's yours now, for good." It was almost too much to process. Riley couldn't speak for a few moments, staring at the men. Then, a wave of relief, stronger than anything she had ever felt, swept over her. "You don't know what this means to me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The older man gave a small, regretful nod. "Good luck with him, kid. Take care of him." As the truck pulled away, Riley stood there, Maverick's head resting gently against her shoulder. Chapter 7. The Strain of Freedom. The barn was quiet that morning. Riley stood in the doorway, watching the golden light of early dawn spread across the pasture. Maverick was grazing peacefully, his dark coat a stark contrast to the lush green of the field. The peacefulness was overwhelming, And yet, as much as she tried to feel content, something gnawed at the back of her mind. She was free now, wasn't she? Free of the buyers, free of the pressure, free to live her life with Maverick. So why did it feel like a weight had settled over her chest? She couldn't deny it anymore. The fear was creeping back in. The fear that Maverick wasn't truly hers, that she wasn't enough to help him heal, that maybe she'd made a mistake. The weight of responsibility was pressing on her, harder than she had anticipated. She had won Maverick from the buyers. She had proved she could do it, that she could fight for him. But now what? Now that he was hers for real, now that she didn't have the looming pressure of someone else's expectations hanging over her, it wasn't the sense of relief she had imagined. It was a quiet panic. There was no one else to blame now. No one to tell her what she was doing wrong, or how to do it better. She couldn't just rely on her instincts anymore. This was real. Every mistake she made with Maverick, every wrong decision, would be on her. She'd spent every day working with him, inch by inch, gaining his trust, but it felt like the harder she tried, the more uncertain he became. At first, he had been an eager student, responding well to her gentle commands. But now, there were days when he pulled away from her touch, days when he seemed to forget everything she had worked so hard to teach him. He wasn't afraid of her. Not anymore. But the bond they were building was fragile. "Maverick," she whispered, standing at the edge of the pasture, her heart heavy with doubt. He raised his head and looked at her, ears flicking in her direction. "Come here, buddy," Riley said, her voice low but steady. He hesitated, just for a moment, then began to walk toward her. Each step was measured, deliberate, like he wasn't quite sure what she expected from him. She swallowed hard, watching him closely as he drew nearer. It had been like this for a week now. Moments of connection, followed by moments of distance. She had thought it would get easier, but it hadn't. In some ways, it was getting harder. When he was finally close enough, she reached out to him slowly, placing a hand gently on his shoulder. She wasn't sure what she was expecting, but he flinched, pulling back slightly as if unsure whether she would hurt him. "Hey," she murmured softly. "I'm not going to hurt you." His eyes flicked up to hers, as if searching for something that was missing. Riley closed her eyes for a moment, trying to steady her emotions. She couldn't let this break her. She couldn't let the fear control her. With a deep breath, she stepped back, not forcing him to do anything. It wasn't the first time he had hesitated, and it wouldn't be the last. But she wasn't going to push him. She wasn't going to break the trust they were slowly building. She would be patient. Over the next few days, Riley focused on one thing: staying consistent. She wasn't going to let her insecurities or her fear get in the way. She could feel Maverick beginning to soften, even though it was so subtle it was almost imperceptible. She would take it day by day. One afternoon, after spending hours in the barn cleaning out stalls and preparing Maverick's feed, she sat on the wooden bench outside, the sun beginning to dip below the horizon. The weight of the day was starting to catch up with her, but she wasn't ready to go inside yet. Not yet. "Maverick," she whispered, her eyes watching the barn door. He appeared moments later, his hooves heavy against the ground as he approached her. Riley smiled, her heart swelling with pride. He was getting there. It was slow, but he was getting there. The bond was deepening. Without thinking, she stood up and walked toward him. This time, he didn't hesitate. She reached out, slowly, carefully, and placed her hand on his neck. Maverick didn't flinch. He didn't pull away. Riley's breath caught in her throat. It wasn't much, just a simple moment of connection, but it was everything. For the first time in what felt like forever, she felt like she wasn't failing him. She wasn't messing it up. She had spent so many sleepless nights wondering if she was enough for him, wondering if she could help him, if she could make him trust her. But now, in this small moment, she realized that maybe the answer wasn't about fixing him. Maybe it was just about showing up. Maybe it was about being patient, even when everything seemed uncertain. Riley smiled softly, her fingers brushing through his thick mane. "I'm here," she whispered. She didn't need to say anything else. Maverick understood. The next morning, Riley woke early, a quiet sense of purpose stirring in her chest. She was used to waking up to the noise of the cafe, clanging coffee cups, the chatter of customers, but it was different here. At the farm, there was only the quiet hum of nature, the gentle rustle of leaves in the wind, and the occasional sound of Maverick's hooves against the ground. It felt more like home than anything else had in a long time. She fed Maverick, spent the morning with him, and then, when it was time to head to the cafe, she felt a twinge of reluctance. Every day now, it felt harder and harder to leave him behind. But she knew she had to. The cafe was her lifeline, even if it didn't feel like it sometimes. As she walked out the door to head to work, she glanced back at the barn, her heart full of love and concern for Maverick. He was out there, grazing quietly, as though everything was finally starting to settle. And for the first time in a while, Riley felt like maybe, just maybe, everything was going to be okay. The day passed in a blur, the clatter of dishes and the chatter of regular customers a far cry from the stillness she had left behind at the farm. But as the hours dragged on, Riley couldn't shake the nagging feeling in her gut. She had been so focused on Maverick, so consumed by his recovery and her fears, that she hadn't given much thought to the rest of her life. Was this all she was meant to be? Just a girl with a horse? Was she really moving forward, or had she just replaced one fear with another? By the time the sun set and she finally closed up the cafe, the exhaustion was weighing on her like a brick. Riley had learned one thing over the past few weeks. Life didn't stop moving. But sometimes, it felt like it was moving in circles. And in that moment, standing outside the cafe with the darkening sky above her, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. Chapter 8. Cracks in the Foundation. Riley couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to break. It had been weeks since the buyers had backed off, and she had settled into the routine of life on the farm with Maverick, but the weight of the responsibility had grown heavier with every passing day. Her days were spent divided between caring for Maverick and working long hours at the cafe, where she could never quite escape the mounting pressure that seemed to hang over her like a storm cloud. The quiet unease in the back of her mind had become a constant companion. It wasn't just the worry about her work with Maverick that plagued her. It was everything. The farm was still barely scraping by, and the money she had left after paying off her debts was running low. Her savings, what little she had, was all tied up in the farm now. There were days when it felt like she was teetering on the edge of a cliff, one gust of wind away from falling into the abyss. She had thought in the beginning that her determination, her fight to keep Maverick, was enough. But now, in the quiet moments when she was alone, doubts began to creep in. Was she really enough for him? Or was the damage too deep, too ingrained in him for her to heal? Her mind raced as she moved through the barn, preparing Maverick's food for the evening. The rhythmic sound of her footsteps against the barn floor did little to calm her nerves. Maverick stood at the far end of the barn, his dark coat gleaming in the dim light of the evening. She watched him, her heart tightening with a mixture of love and uncertainty. She had come so far with him, but there were days when it felt like they were both stuck. It was as though Maverick could sense her unease, his own energy shifting in response. He turned his head slowly to face her, his eyes full of that same mix of curiosity and caution. Riley's breath caught. "Hey buddy," she whispered, trying to steady her racing heart. She took a step forward, reaching out a hand. "It's okay, you're okay." He took a slow step back, his muscles tensing. Riley froze, the air thick with tension. It wasn't the first time he had acted this way, pulling back, unsure of what was happening. It was a reminder of how fragile their bond still was, how every step forward felt like it came at the cost of 2 steps back. "Come on, Maverick," Riley murmured, her voice breaking slightly. "You're okay." She reached out again, and this time, he didn't pull away. But he didn't move toward her either. He stood there, his gaze locked on hers, but the distance between them felt unbreachable. Riley bit her lip, trying to push back the frustration that rose in her chest. She could feel the weight of his hesitation pressing on her. She had been patient. She had been gentle. But something was off. Something was wrong. The sound of a truck pulling up outside broke the moment, and Riley sighed, looking toward the window. Hank's truck. She didn't know whether to feel relieved or irritated. "Hey, Riley," Hank called as he stepped into the barn, wiping his boots on the mat outside. "Hey," Riley said, forcing a smile. She quickly wiped her hands on her jeans before turning back to Maverick. "What's going on?" Hank asked, his voice gentle as he noticed the tension in the air. "Nothing," she said quickly, trying to hide the anxiety creeping into her voice. "Just working with Maverick. Trying to figure him out." Hank's eyes lingered on her for a moment before he spoke again. "You know, I've been thinking. Maybe it's time we do something a little more structured. More formal, I guess. He's not getting the right kind of guidance. Maybe it's time to bring in someone who knows what they're doing." Riley's heart dropped. "What do you mean?" she asked, trying to keep the panic out of her voice. Hank hesitated for a moment, his gaze moving between Riley and Maverick. "I'm talking about a real trainer. Someone who knows how to work with a horse like him. Someone who can get him past his fear. I'm not saying you're doing anything wrong, but maybe you need help. Someone who can push him further." Riley opened her mouth to argue, but the words wouldn't come. She wanted to shout at him, tell him that she didn't need help, that Maverick was hers to train, but something stopped her. It wasn't just Hank's words that stung, it was the truth behind them. She had been struggling. She had known deep down that she didn't have all the answers. She had been trying to be everything to Maverick, but she was starting to realize that maybe she wasn't enough. But still, the idea of bringing in someone else felt like a failure. "I can do this," she said finally, her voice small. Hank's expression softened. "I'm not saying you can't. I'm just saying, sometimes it's okay to ask for help, Riley. You don't have to do it all on your own." The words hit her harder than she expected. She swallowed hard, her throat tightening. She didn't want to admit it, didn't want to face the reality that maybe, just maybe, she was out of her depth. The silence stretched between them, heavy and uncomfortable. Finally, Hank spoke again, his voice quieter now. "Take some time to think about it," he said, his eyes kind but firm. "I'm not trying to tell you what to do. I just want you to know that you're not alone in this." Riley nodded, though it felt like the weight of his words was crushing her. She wanted to believe she could handle it, wanted to believe she could do it all herself. But in that moment, with the growing pressure of everything weighing on her, she wasn't sure if she was strong enough to hold it all together. The following day, Riley found herself staring at the phone in her hand, her finger hovering over the contact for the horse trainer Hank had suggested. She had spent the entire night turning his words over and over in her mind. She didn't want to give in. She didn't want to admit that she needed someone else. But she also couldn't deny the growing tension in her chest, the fear that she was letting Maverick down. Finally, with a shaky breath, she pressed the call button. The voice on the other end was calm, professional. "This is Jake. How can I help you?" I need some advice," Riley said, her voice quivering just slightly. "I have a horse, and, well, he's not responding the way I expected. I think he's afraid of me. And I'm afraid I'm not doing the right thing for him." There was a pause on the other end, and then Jake spoke again. "It's okay to ask for help. Let's talk about what's going on with him. I'll see what I can do." As the conversation continued, Riley's shoulders relaxed just a little. It wasn't a solution, not yet, but it was a start. Maybe, just maybe, asking for help didn't mean she was failing. Maybe it meant she was ready to do whatever it took for Maverick. That evening, Riley stood in the barn again, Maverick grazing quietly in front of her. The uncertainty was still there, lingering in the back of her mind, but for the first time in days, she felt a glimmer of hope. She wasn't alone in this anymore. She had a path forward, even if it wasn't the one she had planned. And maybe that was okay. Chapter 9. The Turning Point. Riley sat on the porch of the farmhouse, watching the first stars begin to appear in the clear night sky. The air was cool, and the soft chirping of crickets filled the silence. It had been a long day, One of those days where every minute felt heavy, full of unanswered questions. The weight of what she had done hung over her, though the smallest spark of hope flickered within her, something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. She had taken the first step. Jake, the trainer, had come by that morning. His presence was different from what she had expected. There was no judgment in his gaze, no criticism in his tone. Just a quiet, focused determination as he assessed Maverick's behavior. He didn't rush him, didn't try to force any responses. Instead, he sat with him, watched him, and simply observed. It was as though he understood that Maverick's pain wasn't just physical. It ran deeper, into the way he had learned to distrust people, into the way fear had shaped his every move. It had taken hours, but Jake had managed to get closer to Maverick than Riley had in weeks. He moved slowly, carefully, never pushing, always letting Maverick choose the pace. It was a method Riley hadn't thought of before, one that seemed so simple, yet profound. Letting Maverick make the choice, choosing when and how to trust, instead of demanding trust right away. At the end of the session, Jake had smiled and turned to Riley. "You're on the right track," he'd said. "It's about patience, trust, and consistency. Keep doing what you're doing, but don't be afraid to let him have the time he needs. He'll come around when he's ready." It had been such a small, simple affirmation, but it had made all the difference. Riley felt a sense of relief she hadn't realized she was holding in. She wasn't alone in this fight. She had a guide, someone who had seen what she had been struggling to understand. She wasn't failing. She was learning. And Maverick wasn't beyond saving. He was just taking his time. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Riley felt a phone buzz in her pocket. She pulled it out, surprised to see a text from Hank. "How's it going with the trainer? You think it's helping?" She smiled, fingers quickly tapping out a response. "It's a good start. I think he's really going to help. I was pushing too hard. I needed to learn to give Maverick the time he needed." Hank's response came just as quickly. "You're not alone in this, Riley. It's okay to ask for help. Just remember, progress isn't always a straight line. But I know you've got this." Riley read the message twice, the words settling into her heart like a bomb. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she wasn't walking this path alone. There were people, Hank, Jake, who were willing to help her carry the burden. Maybe she didn't have to do it all by herself after all. She stood up and walked into the barn, her footsteps steady as she made her way to Maverick's stall. He was resting in the corner, his body relaxed for the first time in what felt like forever. The tension that had been so obvious in his movements seemed to have softened, just a little. Riley smiled, reaching out to gently stroke his mane. "You're doing great, Maverick," she whispered, her voice soft with emotion. "We're both learning. One step at a time." But as she stood there, lost in the quiet connection between them, her phone buzzed again. The message on the screen was from a number she didn't recognize. Riley's heart skipped a beat as she opened it. "Riley, this is Thomas Blackwell. We met at the auction a few weeks ago. I need to talk to you. It's important. Please call me." Riley's stomach dropped. Her pulse quickened as a million questions raced through her mind. What could Thomas want? She had thought the matter with the auction was settled. She had won Maverick, had taken him away from the buyers who had been interested, but now it seemed like something else was at play. A feeling of dread washed over her, and she found herself hesitating before calling back. But she knew she couldn't ignore it. She dialed the number, her fingers trembling as she held the phone to her ear. It rang once, twice, before a voice on the other end answered. "Riley," Thomas's voice was smooth, almost too calm. "I know you're probably wondering why I'm calling. I think we need to talk. About Maverick." Her heart thudded in her chest. What about him? There was a pause. When Thomas spoke again, his voice was softer, almost regretful. "I need you to understand something. Maverick, he's not just any horse. He's worth more than you think. And I'm afraid he might be in more danger than you realize." Riley's breath caught. "What do you mean?" What kind of danger? Thomas sighed on the other end, and Riley could practically hear him rubbing a hand across his face. It's complicated. But I need to meet with you in person. This isn't something I can explain over the phone. Where? Riley's voice was sharp now, her stomach knotting. Her mind raced. What could this man possibly want after everything that had happened? Was this some kind of trick? Had she made a mistake by taking Maverick from the auction? Meet me tomorrow afternoon at the old mill by the river. It's not far from your farm. 2 p.m. I'll explain everything when you get there. The line went silent for a moment, and Riley didn't know what to say. She had already come this far, had already made her decision to keep Maverick. Was this a threat? A warning? Or was Thomas simply reaching out to resolve whatever unfinished business remained from the auction? But the uncertainty gnawed at her. She didn't trust him. Not fully. I'll be there, she said, her voice firm even though her heart was racing. Thomas's voice softened again. Good. I'll see you then. Riley ended the call and stared at the screen of her phone, her mind spinning. What was this all about? Why had Thomas called her out of the blue? As the seconds ticked by, the weight of the decision settled in. She had to go. Whatever was waiting for her at the old mill, she had to face it. For Maverick's sake, for her own sake, she couldn't avoid it. The next morning, Riley woke early, her mind still reeling from the conversation. She spent the morning with Maverick, feeding him, grooming him, trying to steady her nerves for what was to come. But the more she thought about it, the more questions piled up. She couldn't ignore this meeting with Thomas. There was something deeper at play, something beyond the auction. The more she thought about it, the more certain she became. There were pieces of this puzzle that she didn't have, and she needed them. She would face whatever was coming, no matter what. Chapter 10. The Unraveling. Riley woke with a sense of dread hanging over her. The sky was overcast, and the thick, grey clouds mirrored the storm building in her chest. She had barely slept, her mind racing with the conversation from the night before. The meeting with Thomas at the old mill was only hours away, and with each passing minute, she felt a mounting sense of unease. The morning had been quiet. Maverick was in the barn, looking calm and untroubled as he nibbled at his hay. Riley tried to focus on the familiar tasks, feeding the animals, tending to the barn, but her thoughts kept drifting back to Thomas's cryptic words. He's worth more than you think. And I'm afraid he might be in more danger than you realize. What did he mean? Was Maverick in real danger, or was Thomas simply trying to intimidate her, to force her to give him back the horse? The clock on the wall ticked away the minutes, and before long, it was time to leave. Riley threw on her jacket, the weight of her decision heavy in her chest. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to unravel, that the life she had so carefully built for herself and Maverick was teetering on the edge of something dangerous. As she walked out to her truck, her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was Hank. She hesitated, wondering if she should answer, but then decided against it. She needed to focus on this meeting with Thomas first. It felt too important. She drove through the winding roads leading to the old mill. The weather had taken a turn for the worse, with a steady drizzle turning into a light rain. The roads were slick, and the trees lining the way were shrouded in mist, casting an eerie stillness over everything. It was as if the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. When she reached the mill, the first thing she noticed was the silence. It was a familiar silence, the kind that settles in when something has gone wrong, when secrets are being kept. The old stone building loomed ahead, its windows dark and empty. There was no sign of Thomas. Riley parked her truck and hesitated for a moment before grabbing her bag and stepping out into the rain. The air was cold and damp, and as she approached the mill, she felt the weight of her decision settle deeper into her bones. She had come this far, and there was no turning back now. She rounded the corner, the sound of her boots squelching in the mud beneath her feet. As she reached the door, she paused, her hand on the old wooden handle. It was now or never. She pushed it open, stepping into the dim interior. The mill was dusty, abandoned, and full of shadows. The faint smell of mold and rust filled the air, and Riley's heart skipped a beat as she scanned the room, looking for any sign of Thomas. And then, from the far corner, a figure emerged. It wasn't Thomas. Riley froze, her blood running cold as she recognized the man before her. It was the buyer from the auction. The one who had tried to take Maverick from her. The one who had made her feel like she didn't belong in this world of horses. Her breath caught in her throat. "What are you doing here?" she demanded, her voice shaking with a mixture of anger and fear. The man smiled, a cold, empty smile that made Riley's skin crawl. "I think you already know, don't you?" Riley's mind raced, her heart pounding in her chest. She had been right all along. Something was wrong. This wasn't just about Maverick anymore. This was about something much bigger, something she didn't fully understand. She took a step back, her body tensing as she tried to gauge her next move. "I don't know what you want," she said, trying to keep her voice steady, though her hands were clenched into fists at her sides. "Oh, I think you do," he replied, his voice low and threatening. "You've got something that doesn't belong to you, Riley. Maverick isn't just a horse. He's worth a lot more than you think. He's part of a much bigger deal." Riley's stomach twisted with a cold, nauseating realization. The words echoed in her mind, but she couldn't process them fully. "What are you talking about?" "You're in over your head," the man said, taking a step toward her. "And you're not the only one who's interested in him. I made a mistake letting you walk away with him at the auction. Now, I'm here to correct that mistake." Riley's mind raced. This wasn't just about a horse. It was about something deeper, something far more sinister. She had walked into a trap, and she had no idea how to get out of it. The door behind her creaked open, and Riley spun around, heart leaping into her throat. There, standing in the doorway, was Thomas. But he wasn't alone. Another man stood beside him, tall and imposing. His eyes were dark, and his posture was tense. Riley's heart skipped a beat as she realized that the two men were in on it together. They weren't just after Maverick, they were after something else entirely. "Riley," Thomas said, his voice cold and distant now. "I didn't want this to happen. But you've made things harder than they needed to be. You shouldn't have gotten involved with Maverick. This is bigger than you." Riley's mind was spinning. She couldn't keep up with the rapid-fire barrage of new information. She'd been played. By Thomas, by the auction, by the man who had been following her since the day she'd bought Maverick. "You think this is about me?" she asked, her voice steady despite the panic rising in her chest. "This is about him. Maverick. I'm not giving him up." Thomas's face hardened. "You don't understand. There's more at stake here than you could possibly know. Maverick has a history, a background that goes beyond what you can see. You've stumbled into something far more dangerous than you realize. You should have left him alone." Riley's breath caught in her throat. "What are you talking about? What's so special about Maverick?" The man who had been silent until now finally spoke, his voice thick with an accent Riley didn't recognize. "It's not just a horse, Miss Riley. It's a key. And you've just opened the door." A chill ran down her spine as the realization hit her. This wasn't just about a horse. Maverick was involved in something far bigger, a world Riley had never known existed. A world that threatened everything she had built, everything she had fought for. The door slammed shut behind her with a deafening thud, and for the first time in her life, Riley understood what it meant to be completely trapped.